All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Mary Joyce. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I've been excited about this conversation ever since you reached out. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about this Bigfoot thing. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your background and what got you interested in this subject to begin with?
I do a website. It's called skyshipsovercashers.com. We've had it since 2008. And I have done so much research for that website that I've actually collected enough for a book about Bigfoot. So that's how it all got started.
Well, you've been out in the field, you've been researching these things, and you've had experiences of your own. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's start there with your own personal experiences that you've had while you've been out in search of answers about the subject.
The one that comes to mind right at this moment was when a man who lives in the high mountains of North Carolina took me in the back roads up to the mountaintop, and then we walked about a mile into the woods so he could show me a Bigfoot cave. And he's lived on that land ever since he was a kid, so he knew that was a regular hangout for them. And what convinced me that he was telling me the truth was as soon as we started walking into the woods, and he was walking with a machete to clear a path. I mean, that's how thick it was. And we heard this bird sound, which did not sound like a bird, but it was a Bigfoot imitation of a bird. And then off in the direction that we were headed, we heard an answer, the same kind of weird bird sound. And then everything got silent. And to this day, I feel like one Bigfoot was warning another one that two humans were headed in their direction. I did see two large footprints right where I first heard the bird sound. So that was pretty convincing, but I did not come face to face with the Bigfoot. And the cave was good size, and there's a picture of it in my book. It's about 8 feet across and about 5 feet tall. And it was very deep. I could not see into it. And I didn't know if there were Bigfoot in there or if there was a panther or a bear or whatever there might be, but I was not going to be bold enough to venture in. So that's one of my firsthand experiences.
I can't say that I blame you.
You
Go
don't
ahead.
blame me, right? Yeah. Some people are really, really cockeyed brave, but I'm not. Another incident with another cave in the same area. Is a very active place. And the cave is way up a steep cliff. We humans would have to use mountain gear to get up there. I used my camera to get pictures, so I cheated a bit. And there's a regular path from that cave down through the laurel bushes. And we find footprints there on a regular basis. One person was driving at night on this. It's kind of a dirt road. And she saw a Bigfoot actually cross the road. Another person, maybe more than one, could smell the Bigfoot when they went past this major crossing point. And the enticement on the other side of this dirt road, at the bottom of this cliff, is an apple tree, which they love, and a pond. And, who knows what they get from there. So those are two of my personal cave stories.
I got you. I know with the website, you sent me tons of different things that you've been involved with as an investigator and looking into these things. There was one in particular that stuck out that I certainly want to start with and talk about, which is the Valley of the Bigfoot. That's something you were involved in since its inception. So why don't you just tell the audience and me exactly what happened during that situation?
To get these kind of stories, you have to have connections with people who trust you. And there's a woman that I know who is a hairdresser, not mine, but we're friends. And she had a woman who came to her on a regular basis who would talk about Bigfoot being on her land. And it took this hairdresser months before she could convince this woman to share her story with me. And we ended up going to her property. Now, her property, her name, we call her Samantha. Her property is the top of a mountain ridge. You take these winding roads to get there, and then it's like a mile-long path or road that goes between two mountain ridges and follows a creek. When you get to the end of it, there's this bowl-shaped valley It has two houses, a big one and a small one, and a barn and a pond. Um, and that's it. And so I was not alone. There was two of us that went and met with this woman, Samantha. And she said that she knew that there was something living on her land for quite a long time, but things got really hairy. Abruptly, she began to have their vehicles covered with Bigfoot handprints. There were scratch marks, like they were trying to open the vehicles. And one day they actually managed to figure out how to do the handle, got in. Their muddy handprints were all over the inside of one of the vehicles. And they somehow managed to turn on the lights. And after that, the people always locked their cars. But the woman used the term, they always knocked it up a notch. And so after they spent time messing with the different vehicles, they began to explore the smaller house on the property. And in the book, I have pictures of the handprints and the different kind of markings where they're trying to break into the house. They eventually did. And she said they had their muddy prints all over the house. She said that there were droppings that smelled badly. And one time when they weren't there, she went to town and she'd left the dryer going. And apparently this intrigued the Bigfoot. So their handprints were all over the dryer, and they were apparently watching the clothes tumbling. So then they knocked it up a notch again, because by this time the woman is scared to death and she moved into the big house. And this is like I don't know, like a family commune. And her parents used to live in the big house. They no longer did. So she moved in there. And then they began to invade the big house. And I have pictures where they are trying, you can see the claw marks where they reached under one of the bedroom doors that the teenager had locked. And you can see the claw marks on the bottom of the door, like they had tried to pull it open that way. And they got into the bathroom, tore everything up. They played with the toothpaste. They tore up the toilet. And everybody was so happy that they didn't know what the toilet was for, though it would have made a great specimen. Um, and she always talked about there were different size handprints. There were large ones, like basketball player size, medium size, and small. So there were young Bigfoot as part of this clan. And the young Bigfoot took over her children's bedroom. Now, her children were older. These drawings were done below the level of the light switch. So I have pictures of these things that they scribbled all over the wall. The woman, after, very shortly after the small house began to be invaded, she would never go back to the property anymore except with a bodyguard who had a gun. And that's how scared she was. So the day that we were there, she had figured out something important. And that was that they had been fixing the pond. And the pond was actually the creek dammed up to create the pond. They had a man out there with a jackhammer, and he was pounding into the rock, and all of a sudden it went down into something hollow, and the whole pond drained down that hole. She figured out that cave was where these Bigfoot were living, and they were pissed. In other words, they'd been living on this land, the Bigfoot, for a long time, but it wasn't until that happened that they caused trouble. And when she finally figured it out, she communicated telepathically with the Bigfoot, explaining that she did not intend for that to happen. And she tried to get across the idea that they didn't intentionally blow up their cave home. And they accepted this apology because she found it's like a piece of burlap that's shaped into like a little basket. And it had shiny little things in it. And they had left it at her front door, and they quit causing trouble after that. So she went from being terrified and using a bodyguard with a gun to kind of both sides apologizing and getting along.
So I guess the obvious question for me is, these things were breaking in the house and she's finding all this damage and things like that. Did she actually see these things and get a visual sighting of them? And if so, did she describe what they looked like?
Um, She seemed like just vague figures in the forest to that extent. And then one day, they had a game cam out, and it caught something they didn't expect. They expected to catch a Bigfoot. There was a It had to have been an alien. It was a little, she called it a little white dude, little alien dude. And she caught it twice on the game cam walking across the open area. And when she zoomed in on it, it was carrying two little brown furry babies. So go figure. It looks like an alien was involved with, I don't know, the care of the baby Bigfoot. I have no idea. Um, and she did let me see that, but she wouldn't let me post it. She had basically a fear, not so much of the Bigfoot, but fear of the aliens. So that part she wouldn't let me share in my book.
Well, that's a very intriguing story. And I asked if she had actually seen these things because you mentioned something that has always fascinated me with Bigfoot and interactions with Bigfoot is the telepathic communication, or some people call it mind speak. And I want to talk a little bit about that. She described that to you. Did that only happen with her one time? Is that something that you've encountered with these
Really,
habituation type
it's really
situations?
common. It's really common with people I've interviewed who interact with the Bigfoot. It's just like a way of life. And it's not so mysterious. I mean, we really kind of communicate with our dogs and cats at a nonverbal level. And I think we humans have simply lost our ability to do that. We probably have all had that ability. But that is definitely the way communication is done. It's done very commonly. It's not that the Bigfoot don't have their language, because they do, and there's been great research done on that. But in communicating with humans, it's telepathic.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the language before we move on to the next story. I had Ron Moorhead on again recently. I've had him on the show a couple of times. And of course, he and Al Berry famously recorded the Sierra Sounds out in the Pacific Northwest. And Ron certainly believes that there's a language involved in those Sierra Sounds. And of course, it's a subject that everybody comes down on one side or the other. I'm sort of in the middle of that. I'm a very skeptical person by nature. So I don't know if I'm 100% on board with that, but talk a little bit about the research that you're talking about and what has been your experience as far as experiencing language with these encounters.
I have no personal experience with them talking, only secondhand information from people, and it's always been telepathic. Um, yes, there is communication. There's a lot of support for that. It's not so mysterious. Even wolves communicate with each other, making sounds. Um, and the recordings that I've heard, we at one time we had some posted from Russia, recorded by a farmer over there. Of course, I'm familiar with the one you just mentioned. And they're not all the same, but it's clearly sounds that are being made talking to each other. And if I remember correctly from one of that recording, it sounded like a female was chastising a male for being friendly with the humans. And it just had that tone and the kind of interaction you would almost expect from a male and female.
One
Why
of the
are you
most
talking to those people?
one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had on the show. We're 300 plus episodes in on the Sasquatch Odyssey podcast. I talked to a young man out in California who went out into the forest and stayed for weeks on end. And he had some pretty harrowing experiences with Sasquatch. They pinned him inside this bathroom, public bathroom in a camping space in a snowstorm for like 3 days. But in addition to that, with the language part of the conversation, he had an experience where he heard what sounded like a male and a female down in the river splashing around. And the only way he could really describe it was she was pissed off at him for some reason. And he very well believed that it was because he had been interacting with him, the human. So that's very interesting that that parallel is there in multiple situations and in multiple areas. And I think that's one of the most important things about collecting these anecdotal stories, at least in my opinion, as a podcaster who does that. That's one of the reasons that I started my show was to collect these stories and compare them, because That happened in the Pacific Northwest. Your story, we're talking about North Carolina. It happens in Florida. It happens in Russia. So I just really think that that is a common thread, or it seems to have some sort of a common thread that pulls all these things together. So I appreciate you sharing that. It's very interesting that that's the experience that she had. Let's talk a little bit about the other thing that you sent me that really fascinated me was eye to eye with a frightened young Bigfoot. Can you talk a little bit about that situation and what happened there?
What's really nice with the stories that I've gotten, I have interacted with the people who I've interviewed, either personally or via this equipment that we have. And this guy, his name is Ron Hutchkins, and he is a Bigfoot researcher in Middle Tennessee. Now, that is perfect. That's a Bigfoot paradise. There's woods, there's spring water, there's caves, and hardly any people except for people like Randy, who gets out and tries to see them. And one day he was out there and he saw a black hole at the foot of a fallen tree. And suddenly the black hole moved. Well, that got his attention. And his first reaction, well, he watched. And then he realized it was a young Bigfoot that was trying to hide from him. And then it went off and hid in the shrub or in the bushes. And Randy took a picture, and he didn't know if he got anything because he got out of there after that. But he took the picture, and we've posted it on the website, not in the book, just in the website. And it, it looks, I mean, it looks real. You can see the face a little bit. I do explain with the picture that uh, the little Bigfoot is not puckered up like a chimpanzee because there's a berry on a tree branch that's right in front of his mouth. And so if at first glance you think, oh, that's just a chimp doing a puckering motion, but it's not. And for Bigfoot pictures, it's a fairly decent photo. By the way, it had a big emotional effect on Randy. He went home. He couldn't even talk about it. He headed to his bedroom. His wife knew something was wrong, and so she went in to find out. And he had, up to that point, had thought that the Bigfoot was some kind of ancient ape, and he had a name for it. I don't remember what it is. And he saw such humanness in this little Bigfoot baby that it just touched his heart, and he just started to bawl. Now, this man's 6'4". He's never cried like that in his life, but that connection with that little face just really struck his heart. And I think he has 4 kids, and so as a father, he could relate to this frightened child in the woods. And you can see why he'd be afraid of Randy being 6'4", and this is truly a baby Bigfoot.
Let's talk about the next story that really interested me as well is the Bigfoot make soap and bathe. Let's talk a little bit about that and what that was a very catchy title for a story, obviously. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about that?
There was this man, his name is Thomas Hughes, and he lived about 20, 30 miles west of the Sam Houston National Forest in north of Houston, Texas. And he's lived there all of his life. He's had Bigfoot living on his land all of his life. It's not a big deal. But there was one thing on the property or on the land around there that really had always puzzled him. He would find this kind of a scummy, soapy bubble stuff on the ponds, and he would find it on the water tanks. And he never could understand what was causing that. And one day, a woman who had a lot of knowledge um, noticed that he had a lot of golden root growing on his property. And she explained to him that the Bigfoot will take that golden root and grind it with a stone and pulp it, and then mix it with water and use it as soap. So Thomas tried this for himself, and he washed his face using this kind of golden root soap. And lo and behold, what was left in the water looked exactly like what he'd seen for years, like this scummy soap bubble. And Bigfoot really do. They're not all dirty. And I think the ones in the eastern part of the United States are more likely to be civilized than the ones out in the Wild West. Um, for example, There's a woman who has, again, had Bigfoot living on her land since she was a child. And they have seen her and seen her family and seen her kids. And I think they become humanized more than those that live in the wild isolation out west. And um, she talks about them wanting, the females wanting to look pretty and smell pretty. And she said that they would put flowers in their hair, or they would take leaves and design them in a certain fashion to decorate their hair. That she saw them take small branches from trees that would have multiple, um, I don't know, fingers on it, and they would use it like a comb. And again, she's able to telepathically communicate with them. And one of them actually asked her if she would leave a red ribbon out for her. And she did. And the Bigfoot wanted a red ribbon for her hair. So you do not hear stories, at least I don't, from out west. They are a wilder type of creature. The ones in the east have to live closer to humans. And I think in the whole process, they learn how to be more human like. That's just my theory based on what I've seen.
That's an interesting theory. I've never heard that before, but I guess if these things exist at all, I always kind of throw that caveat. If you believe this, any of this at all, that is a very good theory because there are a lot of vast, wide open spaces. Of course, there are here even in the Southeast, but particularly in the Pacific Northwest, they would come into contact way far less with humans than they would in areas. Because I used to think when I first started looking into the subject that these things were out miles and miles. And if you ever wanted to see one, you'd have to be 10 miles deep in the woods. But for you, I'm sure as a researcher as well, you've seen the more people I've talked to, I think these things live more on the periphery of society and they seem to be getting closer into more populated areas.
Well,
That
think
could be,
about this. We humans keep expanding. So, in the eastern part of this country, there's less and less space for them to be. So, they have a choice of learning how to get along with us or hide from us more easily. I think they just have to ingratiate themselves in a way that is not required out in the Rockies.
yeah, I tend to agree. I've the roadside crossings, the very first episode of Sasquatch Odyssey ever was a roadside crossing right here in North Carolina. This guy's driving to work and he looks over and this Bigfoot comes out in front of him and crosses the road. And that is a very common sighting that people have. And the question always pops into my mind, if these things are so elusive and they're so difficult to find, yet somebody almost smacks one with a Prius about once every 3 weeks, it seems, that there's a very interesting dichotomy there because they're, one, very elusive. We don't have proof that they exist beyond my reasonable doubt, at least. And yet people are driving along in fairly populated areas and claim to see these things. And I, for one, don't believe everybody who tells their stories are making them up. I believe that they are seeing something. Could it be a misidentification? Could it be a Sasquatch? I don't know. But it does intrigue me. But you're right. The farther we push into their territory, either they're going to move farther back and find new places to go, or they're going to learn to live where they are and coexist with us. So, very interesting
Well, out
theory.
here in North Carolina, how many more places can they run off to? So, they're living on the periphery.
I agree. Let's talk a little bit about this other. You sent me a list of a myriad of things that I'm sure we won't get into all of this tonight, but the female Sasquatch rescues a little lost boy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's a great little story. A family went camping with another family. They were out in the woods. The adults were around the campfire. It got dark. The little boy, who I think was 6 or 7 years old, wandered off. Of course, nobody knew he'd wandered off. And he got quite a ways from the campsite. And when he realized he was lost, he couldn't even hear the camp. He couldn't see the camp. And he started crying. And out of the bush came a female Bigfoot who grabbed him by the hand and literally dragged him through the forest back to close enough to see the campsite and then let him go. And he did not know what it was at the time. He said he was older and saw the famous Patterson Gimlin film, and that's when he knew that what he'd seen was a Bigfoot. And it's typical for kids to say, well, it was a bear or it was this or that, because they don't have the word Bigfoot in their vocabulary. There was another story, and since you live in North Carolina, I'm sure you heard about it. There was a little boy that was lost I think it was like in January or in the wintertime in the eastern part of North Carolina. And it was in, I think, January. And he was gone for, I think, 3 days and 2 nights or vice versa. And nobody could find him. When they finally found him, he was like tangled in a briar. And he just explained that a bear had been his friend while he was there. So he would have frozen to death under normal circumstances. It's regrettable he doesn't have the vocabulary to really explain what happened to him, because I think he was like 2.5. But at least he knew a bear had taken care of him. Bears don't do that. Bears are also in hibernation that time of year. And bears do not have a reputation for being so kind and thoughtful to small children.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that story. I found that very interesting as well. And the first thing that popped into my mind was that a Sasquatch that took this boy in and kept him safe? Because like you said, I've ran into black bear here on my property, and I don't think she was in any way, shape, or form willing to help me at all. She was worried about her
No,
two cubs that were with her. So
no, I contacted a bear researcher out, I think, at the University of Montana or someplace out west, and he said bears simply wouldn't have acted that way.
there was something else that you sent me that I really wanted to touch on, because this is something that comes up often when I'm talking to people about evidence and proof of Bigfoot's existence. It's always about DNA and eDNA. And there was a bullet point that you sent me about DNA results reveals a Bigfoot is a human hybrid. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Absolutely. First of all, it's Dr. Ketchum who did the initial study on it. And believe it or not, when she first came out with the idea that Bigfoot were half human and half some unknown species, she was really belittled in the scientific community. Since then, a number of her critics have come around and done their own research and confirmed what she initially proposed. And what happens is that if you, let's say you have a strand of hair that you think might be a Bigfoot, if you analyze the hair, it will come out always as human. The only way you discover the paternal side of the Bigfoot is you have to get the root of the hair, because the paternal side is in the nucleus of the cell. So that's why many things are, just dismissed as, oh, that's just human. Um, but she found conclusive evidence that the paternal part in the nuclear part of the DNA is some unknown species.
Yeah, I'm very
Is that what
familiar
you were?
with. Yes, I'm very familiar with Dr. Ketchum's work, and I've actually, there was a couple of years ago she was really getting raked over the coals, and there was another podcast that came out and had a scientist on that basically just tore her research apart and broke it down step by step. So I reached out to Dr. Ketchum and said, hey, I'd like to bring you on the show, and if you want to answer to that, you can. Got a pretty decent sized audience to tell your side. And she was involved in some other things, and she politely said, maybe sometime in the future, but she wasn't doing any podcasts at the time. And I've went back and forth because I have listened to people who, everything has a reaction, and there's plenty of people that put forth a lot of things that say her research is garbage and this, that, or the other. I don't have a dog in that fight, but I think I've asked that plenty of times. I've asked Dr. Meldrum when he was on the show about DNA and eDNA, and if it would ever be enough to really prove the species. And of course, the answer is no. It's going to take a body. Somebody's going to have to bring one of these things in that died of natural causes, or somebody shoots one of these things. I'm not really a proponent of somebody going out and killing one of these things, but I think that's really what it's going to take for us to finally put this to rest. Because, and we'll talk a little bit about it. I want to move into some of the evidence here in a second, but I could not leave this one on the table, because I say this on my podcast. I've heard other podcasters use this sort of phrase about, we don't have one of these things in our basement to study, so nobody really knows about what's really going on with them. And the bullet point is a Sasquatch in the basement. So can you talk about, tell the audience a little bit about that?
This man is a Canadian. He is in the health profession, and he's recalling an experience when he was a young boy. And he says this is vivid in his mind today as when it happened because it was so unique. And he and his parents and his sister went to visit relatives in a western part of Canada. I think it was British Columbia. Not sure I got that right now. And the parents got one of the kids out of the way. They were around a table talking, and I guess the kids were being disruptive, and they sent them down the basement to play. And when they opened the door to the basement, there was what he tells me was a adolescent Bigfoot. It wasn't big enough to be a real Bigfoot, but it was as tall, if not taller, than his parents. It was just standing there, scared them to death. They went running up the stairs and screaming, "There's a bear or something in the basement." Of course, their parents thought they were just playing. They wouldn't give them a serious moment. Um, what's interesting is there was access to that basement from the basement to the outside. There was food stored down there. Um, so his conclusion and my conclusion is that the Bigfoot was looking for food in the basement. But when something happens that's so vivid that somebody remembers it years, if not decades later, as vividly as it happened yesterday, that only happens with real experiences.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I want to talk a little bit about the evidence. And as many stories as you've collected and as much research you've done into people's experiences and encounters, are you finding a lot of commonality with the presence of tree structures and these X formations and these fulcrum type formations that people I've experienced here on my property? I found plenty of these things here that could be natural, it could be deadfall, but some things are just like intricately woven together. I've seen tons of photographs and people have sent me tons of pictures and videos of these things. Are you finding that commonality in some of the stories that are going along with these encounters? And if so, do you have a theory on what any of that means?
I did one posting where I had, at least a dozen or more individual separate cases of the structures that they build. And there's a similarity, but they're not all the same. But you can see there's a basic concept, even though they can look different. Um, it's very common. And unless it's just the start of one of these, it can't be readily dismissed as just a bunch of trees falling into an igloo type of or a teepee type of pattern, which is the most common pattern. It just wouldn't happen that way. If things are going to fall, they tend to fall all in the same direction, like the wind blows them down. But these are like around like this, and sometimes the center structure will be another tree, and clearly those have been wrapped around that center structure. So yes, they do build these places as at least places to take a nap.
There was another thing that I wanted to talk about before we move on as well. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Paul Freeman footage from back, it was, I think, early 90s when Paul Freeman got his footage. And his son Michael has put out a book recently. I had Michael on the show, and we've talked about the footage that Doug Hychek has went in and enhanced. And part of that was there is, I've seen the enhanced version. It's only out in the book. I saw it a couple of months before the book come out because they sent it to me. But in this enhanced version, it's clear that, at least to me, that this creature, this very large creature, you can't tell if it's a male or female. It looks to be a Sasquatch, walks across a path and walks over to a tree and picks up what looks to be a baby or a toddler and puts it around its waist, just like a mom or dad would a human child. And you see this thing's legs dangling, and it clearly looks like a baby. One of the bullet points you sent me from one of the stories you talked about was a face-to-face meeting with Bigfoot, mama, and baby. Can you talk a little bit about that and what happened during that encounter?
I need to give you some background on the person who gives me some of these stories. Her name is Robin McCrae, and she's, again, one of these people who's had Bigfoot living on her land all of her life. And she communicates them so well with them that she was invited to go to Russia in 2012 as part of an effort to prove the existence of Yeti or Bigfoot over there. So she's not just some run of the mill person who claims to have Bigfoot living on their land. She's really very credible. And um, she had never seen one of the baby Bigfoot, only the adults. And one day she looks out her, probably her kitchen window, and she sees at first she thought it was a person, and it was a Bigfoot walking along the tree line. And when she went out there, it was a female Bigfoot with her baby, and she came to show Robin her baby, which shows incredible trust because they are so protective of their children. And she said she would set the baby down, the Bigfoot, and it would climb up a tree, just a couple feet, and then it would come down, and she'd take it to the next, or go to the next tree. When it got too far, she'd go and pick it up and bring it back, and this game of climbing the tree would start over again. So Robin got to see the baby up really close. She said she couldn't tell if it was male or female, but she felt like it was a little boy. And um, after that happened, the mother and the baby went off and just kind of like faded out in front of her. And Robin is one of those who believes that the Bigfoot do have this ability to, I don't know, fade out right in front of you. And in fact, I will have to do some more research with several different people um, with their conclusion about this because it's debated. It's debated. Are they just physical? Are they just, I don't know, can they make the transition from one energy level to another? And I will have to do something in depth about that.
I think one of the things that comes up often for me, at least, and I don't know if you're familiar with this story or not, out of Tennessee, the Janice Carter 50 years with Bigfoot. I've done a couple of shows and a follow-up show on the Janice Carter story. And here's the thing that always comes up for me, and here's the rub, and I'll ask this of you. When it comes to, say, Janice, for example, my question to people in habituation sites is often these very close-up encounters and these multiple decades of experiences with these creatures are very fantastical claims. I think we can both agree on that. And it came up during the Janice Carter story is where or how can you prove your experience? Now, most people say, I'm not here to prove anything, or I don't have to prove anything. It's my experience. And I totally agree with that. As somebody who does an entire show on nothing but anecdotal stories. But in fairness, when people hear stories like that, the first thing that comes to most people's mind is, if that's the case, then why don't you have a picture? Why don't you have a video? Why isn't there some sort of way to prove your fantastical story? Is that something you run into? Are those questions that you ask people that you talk to? Or do some of these people actually show you undeniable proof of what they're saying is being reality? I guess would be the question.
Before I forget this, there's a video. I've sent you a link to it that I hope you personally will be able to look at. And there was a kayaker in the swamps in Florida, and he was just out in the really thick swamp, and there he saw Bigfoot, and they call him a swamp ape in Florida. And he had his camera, and because a kayak is kind of quiet, he was able to get a pretty darn good clear video of this Bigfoot hunting his lunch. And you can, if you saw one still from that video, it would not be convincing. But the motion through the video, you can actually see this Bigfoot or this swamp ape catch a snake in the water for his lunch. And I hope you personally will be able to take time to look at that one.
Yeah, I definitely will. So have you had experiences with people like that have had those, that have been able to get those kind of photographs or videos, or is it just usually just the experiences?
On my website, skyshipsovercashers.com, I believe in the importance of photos and visual imagery to go along with testimony. So I try to get photos whenever I can. That video I just mentioned, I've had that posted because I want people to see something that looks convincing. The photo that Randy took of the baby Bigfoot that was afraid of him, that's pretty darn good too. Um, under most circumstances, the Bigfoot will not allow themselves to be photographed. So if they're conscious that somebody's there with a camera, they're not going to cooperate. I mean, that seems to be pretty well proven. You catch them if they're like totally engrossed in like hunting their lunch, um, or if they're something like that. They have to be totally focused on something else before you'll be able to catch them uh, in action.
We've mentioned it a couple of times, so I definitely want to talk about your one of your most recent books, Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints. Let's talk a little bit about how that came about, what made you decide to write that book, and what can people expect when they go out and pick it up?
It focuses on, it's called Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints. I got tired of just hearing about footprints. I got tired of just seeing footprints. Certainly, there's got to be more than that. Um, I had collected the stories for the website that I work on, skyshipsovercachers.com. And it came to the point where I realized I had so much stuff that I decided to put it in a book. There is a focus to it, even though I have two stories in there where the Bigfoot are kind of violent. It, for the most part, focuses on the human side of Bigfoot. And again, I think because I'm in the eastern part of the United States, I'm exposed to more of those kind of stories than people out in the West. And I'll give you another story from that book. There was a man who was a sheriff in Florida who had to retire early because he had cancer. So he came up here to the mountains. He bought a home or a cabin in a remote part of one of the forests up here. Straight mountain behind him, no people around him. He lived off an old a logging road. And the first hint that he had that there were Bigfoot on his land was the cracking of a limb against a tree, you know, the real loud sound. He ultimately figured out that whenever his closest neighbor was shooting off guns and doing target shooting, the Bigfoot would protest by whacking trees with a big branch. That was his first clue. And then one day he's on his porch, which is up elevated with a stream down below it, with trees and stuff, so he can't really see the stream. And he heard what sounded like children splashing in the water. Well, he's on an old logging road. There's no children anywhere around where he lives. So what was this? So this he put it in the back of his mind to figure out later. And another time he was out on his porch and he had a light by his garage where he parked his vehicle, and he saw a family of Bigfoot crossing the road. And he learned that this was a regular path that they would take. Ultimately, he became friends with the male Bigfoot. He even named him, he called him Fred. And Fred would come down to where this sheriff would be doing his gardening, and they would communicate telepathically. And the sheriff guy would share things from his garden with Fred, and they got along just fine. It's those
Very
kind of
interesting.
stories. It's
Go ahead.
those kind of it's those kind of stories that I have in the book because they at least here around here where I live, they act very human. And even have a story from out in Arkansas, and a woman had she was in the mountains of Arkansas, and she went out to, I think, feed her horses, and she saw a male Bigfoot, and she said that he had this startled look on his face and communicated like, you weren't supposed to see me. And then he vanished off from there. And then another time she saw him with his family. And the family is typically a male, a female, and two younger ones. And I don't know why that pattern repeats, but that I hear that over and over and over again. And she noticed that grain was missing sometimes from her barn, and then she saw them one day taking some of it and disappearing into the woods. But she had a lot of compassion for them because he looked just horrified that she had seen him because she wasn't supposed to see him.
There was something else that's kind of off topic from Bigfoot, but it's very fascinating to me because I've had conversations with people. I have a friend who lives down in Alabama who's a Bigfoot researcher, and he's been out in the woods tons of times and had interactions with Sasquatch. But in addition to that, he was walking across a trail at one point, and a little, what he described in Jonathan's words, was a little, for lack of a better word, a miniature, like American Indian, right? Native American. And this thing runs up, and it was green, and it stops in the middle of the trail, and then it runs off to the side of the trail and hops down the side of this embankment. And you have a book called Cherokee Little People Were Real. Can you talk a little bit about what people can expect in that book? And are there stories similar to that in that book? Is that where that book was born from?
When I moved to North Carolina, I didn't know a squat about Cherokee Little People. And I, like you, am a little bit of a skeptic and kind of blew it off as just old stories and legends. And then one day, a man came into where I was working, who I had known in other occasions, and he was well respected in the community. He was in his late 80s at the time I met him. Um, and he had been a pastor in the area for like 40 something years. He'd been a World War II hero, had wonderful credentials. And he told me one day, he said, no, the Cherokee Little People are real. And when he was a young man right after World War II, he was involved in early construction at Western Carolina University, which is in Cullowhee, North Carolina. And he said that when they would cut into virgin soil, they would find these little tunnels, and the tunnels were always square cut with an arched top, always cut through red, dense clay. And, he convinced me that this must be something real. And he very kindly opened the door for me, many doors for me. And I spent many Saturdays around coffee tables or breakfast tables with old timers that he introduced me to, collecting their stories um, about, most of them were involved with the early construction of that university. And it used to be it must have been a little people underground community for a very, very long time. And so I got the testimonies of these guys. I simply wanted to save it. And I originally just put it in like manuscript form and gave it to the museums. Well, I began to do more and more research. I got photos and I got maps and I found out more things. And eventually I put it into a regular book, and it's called Cherokee Little People Were Real.
I will definitely want to check that out because it fascinates me. Let's talk a little bit about, you've mentioned it a couple of times, just briefly go back over the website and what people can expect when they go to the website, and tell everybody where's the best place to go and pick up your books.
Okay, let's see if I can keep all that straight. The website is skyshipsovercashers.com. You know how to spell all the words except cashers. It's spelled just like a cashier at the grocery store. Skyshipsovercashers.com. It started in 2008 because we were seeing so many UFOs over the mountains here in Western North Carolina. But it has grown way beyond that. We used to do stuff on Bigfoot, the little people, secret underground bases. Anything that really kind of catches my attention, we go with it anymore. Um, you can learn about the books if you go to the website and just open up Editor's Corner. You can click on something at the top. It'll take you right to the 5 books that I have in print. It'll give you a quick summary of each of them. All the books are available on Amazon. So I think I covered it there. Not sure, unless you want me to
You
list the
did,
book. I can
you
list the
did
book. Skyshipsovercashers.com is the website. Cherokee Little People Were Real is one book. Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints is another. Underground Military Bases Hidden in North Carolina is another one. A 5th one seems like it's totally off the wall. It's tangible evidence of Jesus left behind for us to find. It's archaeological and scientific evidence that people have found.
and Spy in the Sky, Secrets
Oh,
and
yes.
Cover.
How can I forget the most recent one? Thank you. That one just came out. That's the one I'm talking about the most anymore. And that is exciting as far as I'm concerned. I have found by using Google Earth evidence that you just would not believe on Mars, on the moon, at the bottom of the ocean, in Antarctica. For example, on Mars, I have a satellite photo of a giant UFO actually parked on the planet. You can see the shadow beneath it. It's about 3.5 miles in diameter. I have found a habitat that clearly is modern. I suspect it's human. Uh, um, there's one in the northern hemisphere, one in the southern hemisphere. Um, I found evidence of contemporary building and structures on Mars, and I put the coordinates there with every image that I have. And I describe this book as a picture book for adults, because there's photos on almost every page. And I think that's real important for people to see this. And then with the coordinates, they can go and check it out for themselves, so they know I'm not just somebody busy doing Photoshop.
That book is called Spy in the Sky: Secrets and Cover Ups on Earth and Beyond. Mary Joyce, thanks so much for coming on and sharing the books and sharing the amazing stories. I've had an absolute blast talking to you.
You're very kind. Thank you. I wish you all the best with your program.